is this whole bone right here, and coming in kind of towards the eye region, then we'll have the frontal notches, which kind of take place in this area, as this skull doesn't really have too much of a frontal notch or a supraorbital foramen, but it's basically takes place up in this area. Then you have the whole orbital cavity, which is this area. You have the two wings of the sphenoid bone. You have the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, which is right here, and then also out here, you can see it on both sides. And the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone is inside in this area. In your orbital fissures, you have your inferior orbital fissure, which is just this fissure area right here, and your superior orbital fissure right here. Then you have your zygomatic bone, which is basically just this bone right here. Your infraorbital foramen is that foramen right there. This is your whole, which is part of your whole maxilla bone, which is this whole bone right here. It's your maxilla. Then you have your mandible, which is the lower jaw area. So this area over here is the body of your mandible. Then you have the ramus of your mandible, which is this area. Then you have your two mental foramen on both sides, right there. And you have your mental protuberance, which is right in the middle, right in this area right here, mental protuberance. And you have your anterior nasal spine, which is right just above the teeth, right in this area, your anterior nasal spine. Your nasal concha, which are internal here. You have your inferior nasal concha and your middle nasal concha. And your nasal septum is actually, it would just kind of be this area right in the middle here. And if you had cartilage, your nose was still there, it would make up your nasal septum. Your nasal bone is just above that here, which is just this area. And then as you come over more into the orbital area, you have your lacrimal bone, which is just this bone right here. It goes down and you have your tear ducts that run right in this area. Yeah, that's your lacrimal bone. Your nasion, is right here. It's the junction between your frontal bone and your nasal bone. And then you have the glabella, which is just above that up here. And then you have your supraorbital margin, which is just basically the top part of your eye. And then the infraorbital margin, which is just basically the lower part here. And then you also just internally have your perpendicular plate, which runs between your two middle nasal conchas and then meets together here with your vomer. Your vomer's at the bottom here. And then on the back you'd also see just your vomer in that area. So anyway, that's the skull. Okay, we have the mandible. So just starting at the front here, we have the coronoid process, which goes then to the condyle, or the condyloid process, which is just made up of the head and neck and pterygoid fovea on this. And then we have the angle of the mandible, which is just down here, which is just below the ramus. Body of the mandibles here. Once again, we have the mental foramen that are just right there. The mental tubercle, which is just down here at the bottom. It's a little tubercle that sticks out. And then on the inside part of it, you have the mental foramen, which is basically go right in here. That's your mental foramen. And just above that is your lingua, or lingula. So that's your lingula, just above the mandibular foramen. And then the last thing you have here is just your digastric fossa, which is just these areas on both sides here. Okay, the lateral view of the skull. Okay, to start off, we have the parietal bone here. And this is the coronal suture that separates the parietal bone and the frontal bone. Then you have the lacrimal bone, which once again is just inside of the orbit of the eye. So it makes for a lacrimal bone that has the tear duct down here. You have the frontozygomatic suture, which is just this little suture here between the frontal bone and the zygomatic bone. And on the zygomatic bone, you have what we refer to as the zygomatic arch, which actually is just between the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone. The temporal bone is this here, the sagittal suture, just separating the temporal bone and the parietal bone. Down at the bottom here, you have what we refer to as the mastoid process, and then coming off here, which you normally see something jetting off a little bit more, is the styloid process. And then just here we have the external acoustic meatus and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Just above that we have the greater wing of the sphenoid that you could also see from inside the orbit of the eye. And then this area right here where all these sutures basically come together is called the pterion, where the frontal, parietal, and temporal and sphenoid bones all meet, and it kind of makes that an H with all these sutures. Then you have the temporal lines on the head. You have your superior temporal line here, and then your inferior temporal line here, just a little bit up higher on the head. Then you have your lambdoid suture, which is just towards the back here, which is this spot that separates the parietal bone from the occipital bone. So this is the occipital bone, and then this pointy part all the way on the back is considered the external occipital protuberance.